Hello and welcome to the third video in MuFood's series on how to compost. Today we're going to be talking about the different ways that you can make your compost. But before we go into more detail on that, I'm just going to do a quick recap from the first two videos. The main thing being that composting is easy. You can do it, and it's a great way to help your garden and also to lower your carbon footprint. The second thing is that the key to successful composting is just providing a happy home for the soil microbes to do their work. And the third thing is that the way to do that is to have a really good mixture of greens and browns. The greens are the fresh living ingredients like your carrot peelings or your grass clippings, things like that. And the brown materials are the dry, dead ingredients like straw and cardboard and things like that. So when you look online about how to compost, there's loads of information, which is great, but it can get a bit confusing. Now, for most people, for most purposes, there are three main ways to compost. There are wormeries, there's hot piles, and there is cold composting. So we're going to have a look at the advantages and the disadvantages of those three kinds so you can best work out what's best for you. Let's talk about wormeries to start with. Wormeries are simply a box that is stocked with special worms who will, in return for having a good home, they'll eat your kitchen scraps and they'll poo out compost, which is fab. They also produce a liquid that's a really strong fertilizer for your plants, which is a useful byproduct too. Now, wormeries, the advantages of wormeries is that you can have them in a really small space. It's just the size of a small container. So that's great if you don't have a lot of room. They're also quicker than cold composting. If you give your worms a happy home, then they'll really get through the scraps quite quickly. And they're also just magic to do with kids. They're really good fun if you've got a family. They love seeing the worms get to work. Now, the disadvantages is that they can be really expensive to buy. If you just buy a wormery all set up, that can be pretty dear. Then I'm going to put a link in the show notes about how you make one from an old box. So if you've got a drill, or you can borrow one, and you've got a few skills, then you can make a wormery pretty easily. However, you do need to buy the worms. So you can't just go foraging for earthworms. They won't do the same job. You do have to buy the worms online, but they're not too dear. And it's quite exciting getting a package in the post full of live worms. The other disadvantage is that because you're caring for a creature, you do have to make sure that they have good conditions. So part of that is not giving them too much at one time. So you can't, throw in all your grass clippings or something like that. It's just good for small, regular kitchen scraps. And you also can't give them too many onions or garlics or citrus. So there's a little bit of care involved. And over the winter, wormeries shouldn't freeze. So if you have a sheltered spot that you can put them, like in a shed or in a corner round by the house that's sheltered from most of the weather, then that will help you be successful as well. So that's wormeries. So next on my list is hot piles. Now, a hot pile is just a big compost pile that you make all in one go. So you gather all the ingredients that you need and then you build a big pile. The reason why it's called a hot pile is because the perfect mix of greens and browns and air and water accelerates the composting process. So it happens really quickly, and heat is a byproduct of that decomposition process. And because it's happening on a big scale, a grand scale, it creates a lot of heat, and it can get over 60 degrees Celsius, which is pretty amazing. The advantages of a hot pile is that the heat that it creates, if you build it properly, the heat kills weed seeds and pathogens and things like that. So you get a very clean compost that won't germinate weed seeds when you put it on your garden. It's also, because it's a big pile that you're making, you end up with a big pile of compost, which is also pretty useful. This process only works when you do a big pile. You can't make a little hot pile because the microbes don't get the environment they need to create all that heat. And it's also very quick. So with hot pile composting, you're getting useful compost within a matter of weeks instead of having to wait for months. So those are the advantages. The disadvantages is that it is quite a lot of effort. You've got to go to the effort of gathering all the materials. You've got to have the effort of layering them and putting them together right for it to work. So you've got to have a bit of know-how to do that. And you've also got to turn it several times over those weeks that you're making the compost. So it's an intensive effort, but you get a lot of compost in return. And if you can source the materials for free, you can get manure from farmers, you can get grass clippings from all sorts of people and autumn leaves and things like that, then it's a very cheap way to make compost as well. Now I use pallets. I simply tie 4 pallets together, load all my materials in, and then when I need to turn it, I just untie one of the pallets and give it a good turn. So it can be a very cheap way to make a lot of very good quality compost. So last on our list is cold composting. And this is the one that we're actually going to be focusing on because it's the most common form of composting that people do in their back gardens, and it's also the most accessible. So cold composting is just a compost pile that you add to bit by bit. So instead of gathering everything that we need in one big pile like we did for the hot pile, cold composting, just when you have stuff, you add it to your bin. So it's pretty easy in that way. The advantages is just that it's easy, it's lazy, you don't have to put a lot of effort in, it's just a case of putting your scraps and things in the right place. It's also useful because you can add materials as you have them. So it doesn't matter if one week you put in just a handful of carrot peelings and the next week you've got a bucket load full of grass clippings. Your compost will deal with that. The other advantage is that it's quite easy to sort out problems because it's a slow process. It's quite forgiving. So if you notice an issue, you've got time to deal with it. Whereas the hot pile, it can go wrong quite quickly. And with the worms, if you don't give them the right home, then the consequence is that the worms will die. Whereas with this, there's no big consequences. You just sort it out as you notice any problems, and that's grand. Now the disadvantage is that because this doesn't get hot, it doesn't kill the weed seeds. So it does mean that the compost that you get from a cold compost bin will likely create some weeds when you put it on your garden. Just means a little bit more weeding. It's also very slow, so you'll be waiting about a year before this compost is ready. But that's okay. If you don't want to put a lot of effort in, that's just fine. Now, if you've decided that you want to do cold composting, what happens next? How do you get set up? Now, your first question is, where do you want to put it? And I would always advise putting compost bins somewhere where it's easy to get to. If it's difficult to get to your compost bin, realistically, you're not going to use it. So put it somewhere where it's easy for you to go from your kitchen or from your garden to your bin to use it. You can put this on soil, or you can put it onto hard standing, some gravel or paving slabs or something like that. But if you do put it onto paving slabs, you need to make sure that you add some soil into your bin to put those useful microbes into your bin so they can do the work for you. So if you set it up on something that's not soil, just make sure you add some soil to your bin to start with. So when you've got your bin, you just level a spot. If you're going into soil, it's quite useful to bury it in a bit so it doesn't blow away. And then you can add some browns right at the bottom, and then you just start adding your kitchen scraps, which is nice and easy. So, as with all the composting that we've been talking about, the key is getting that mix of greens and browns. And this is where almost all of the issues that I hear about from people's home composting comes from not using enough browns in the mix with the greens. So every time you put some greens in, so I've got some dead flowers and apple cores and things like that. Every time you put some of those in, you have to put the same amount of browns in. Now, your browns, you can put them in bit by bit, like this, as you have them, as long as you're putting in the same amount. Now, the reason I'm ripping this up is that the smaller things are, the faster they'll compost. So to avoid having big lumps of cardboard, it is quite good to rip them up. But I have to say the biggest tip that I can give is to have a container next to your compost bin that's just full of browns ready to go. So I tend to use quite a lot of straw because I have access to it, and you just cover over whatever you've put in with browns, and there you have it. It's as simple as that. Now, a lot of people may, if you've done any reading, you may ask about turning. Should you turn your compost? Now, the baseline is that you can easily make compost without turning. It'll be slower, and if you don't have the recipe right, the mix of the greens and the browns, then you might come to use your compost and find that it hasn't composted properly. So turning is a good idea if you have the time and the energy. Now, the reason why turning helps is that, one, it puts air back into the compost, which is good for our microbes. And the second thing is that you can spot any issues. You can see if it's too wet or if it's too dry or anything like that. I tend to do what I call a compromise turn. I can't really be bothered to lift all of this off and really deal with the stuff that's inside. So every now and again, all I do is take a garden fork and give it a bit of a twist and lift. I just give it a bit of a rummage, mix everything up, and that seems to do the trick. So that's pretty easy. And it really is as simple as that. In a year's time, once this is full, you can open it up at the bottom and scrape out all the compost that you've made. And if you start to find bits of food that haven't composted, it just means that you've reached the level that you need to stop, and you just leave the top stuff to compost a bit more. And that's about it. Now, we're going to do a quick rundown on the common issues that people have with their composting. So if you find that your compost is slimy or smelly or seems quite wet, that means you haven't used enough browns. It's a really common thing, so don't worry. All you have to do is just add a load more browns into the mix it up with a garden fork, and that'll dry it out and it'll give it a better mix. This happens really commonly with grass clippings. So whenever you put grass clippings in, only put them in thin layers with browns in between. So you're layering it up, and that stops the grass getting all slimy and horrible. If you find, on the other hand, that your compost is too dry, then all you need to do is water it. It's as simple as that. And if you find that when you open the lid, loads of little flies come out, they're not doing any harm, but it's not very pleasant. So what I'd suggest is whenever you put your vegetable peelings and stuff in, just bury it, like make a little hole, put the veg scraps in, and then cover it with browns. So the top layer is always browns, and then that means that the flies won't really be able to get in at the scraps. And the last thing is if you have rodents. Now, it is pretty hard to keep mice out of your compost bin, I have to say. You know, they don't do any harm. If you find you have rats, then the likelihood is you're adding something that you shouldn't. So the things that attract rats are cooked food, bread, meat, fish, dairy products, and oil. So as long as you avoid all of those things, then rats shouldn't really be attracted to your compost bin. So just use your uncooked vegetable scraps and your fruit scraps, and you should be fine. I'm really excited to hear how you get on. So whatever type of compost you use, whether it's the cold composting, a wormery, or a hot pile, get in touch with MooFood and tell us how you're getting on. Thank you very much for watching. And next video, we'll be talking about how best to make use of your compost to stretch it so that you can use it as much as possible in your garden.